Hello and welcome to the Verbal Fluency lecture as part of the ENIGMA-U neuropsychology lecture series. My name is Emma Reed. I have a bachelor's in neuroscience, and I am currently working as a research assistant study coordinator at the Traumatic Brain Injury and Concussion Center at the University of Utah. I do a ton of work with neuroimaging as well as neurocognitive data. And recently, I've done a lot of projects with Enigma on verbal fluency specifically, harmonization projects, reviews, things like that. And so today we're going to be talking about what verbal fluency is, what it measures, how you test for it, and what deficits in verbal fluency can tell us about our cognition. So let's just hop right in. Before we proceed, I'm actually going to move this a little so that you can see the screen. So before we proceed, I just wanted to make a quick shout out that a lot of the information from this lecture, the organization, some of the definitions, a lot of the citations that I got are from the Compendium of Neuropsychological Tests by Esther Strauss. The third edition specifically is the one that I looked at. Here's the citation right here. This is an awesome neuropsychological resource, and I highly recommend it, not only for learning about verbal fluency, but for learning about any other neuropsychological tests that you could be interested in. Okay, so let's hop right in. What is verbal fluency? So verbal fluency, a quote here, is a cognitive function that facilitates information retrieval from memory. Successful retrieval requires a couple things. That retrieval requires executive control over your cognitive processes, such as selective attention, selective inhibition, mental set shifting, internal response generation, and self-monitoring. So what does that mean? Let's go break this down a little bit. Basically, tests of verbal fluency are going to evaluate an individual's ability to retrieve specific information within restricted search parameters. And I'll explain a little bit more what that means in context in a couple slides. So as a base here, two neurological functions are largely tested by verbal fluency. The first is your semantic store. So your knowledge base of words, concepts, categories that you just have in your brain. And then the second thing that verbal fluency tests is whether or not you have an effective search process by which you can access that semantic store and retrieve that information within the bounds of a specific search. Verbal fluency is generally an umbrella term as well, and it can be divided into more specific components or more specific tests. So verbal fluency in general, let's just talk a little bit about how it's tested. So in general, the general task format is that you as a researcher or examiner are going to provide a parameter for some verbal responses. You're going to give them a rule. And then you're going to give the participant 1 minute, usually, to provide as many correct responses as they can. Like we said here, the two components that verbal fluency is generally divided into is phonemic or letter fluency and semantic or category fluency. Both of these two types of tasks are going to have the same general task format, just with different search parameters. So in phonemic or letter fluency, the parameter that you're going to be providing is a letter that the words must begin with. So you'll tell the participant, for example, you're going to have 1 minute to respond. Tell me as many words as you can that begin with the letter F. Go. And then the participant has 1 minute per letter to give as many correct responses as possible. Whereas in semantic or category fluency, same idea, but this time you're going to be providing a category that the words need to fall into. So you're going to give them a category like, tell me as many animals as you can think of in 1 minute, or as many fruits or vegetables. It doesn't matter what letter they begin with, they just need to fall within the same general category. And with these, you often will give them other rules that they cannot provide. For example, in letter fluency, a lot of times they'll say, tell me as many letters or words as you can that begin with the letter S. However, you can't give me any proper nouns. So you can't give me any names of people or places or numbers. There will be some other restrictions that also will start to look into your inhibition processes and stuff like that. So let's break down phonemic fluency a little bit more. Like we talked about in the last section, in a letter fluency test, the participant needs to produce as many words as possible that begin with a specified letter during a fixed period of time. And that period of time is usually 1 minute. So usually you'll have more than one trial. Usually you'll have about 3 trials with 3 different letters in a row. And the groupings, the most common grouping is to give them FAS. So tell me as many words as you can that begin with F for 1 minute, then A, and then S. Although CFL, PRW, and BHR are also common test parameters in some batteries. I'll give you a quick history of phonemic fluency tests because I think it's fascinating. The first phonemic fluency test that was developed was by Thurstone. He called it the word fluency test. And in this one, instead of saying the words, you would write down the words that began with a specific letter. And instead of 1 minute, he gave them 5 minutes to respond. Then Benton and his team came along and introduced the verbal counterpart with the letters FAS and then changed the time limit to 1 minute. He also later on, 5 years later, developed some norms for letter fluency, which are so important, and we'll talk about a little bit later. He did 1 minute tests for every single letter except for X and Z on 66 maternity ward patients. And then he looked at their response times or looked at their response totals, and he divided the letters into difficulty categories. So he had a set of letters that were hard, a set of letters that were moderate, and a set of letters that were easy. And they're right here, just in case you're interested. And then a lot of different test batteries will use those normed letter difficulties to develop a test batter or to develop a set of letters that they want to use in their tests. Usually you want to keep it within the moderate to easy range, but you also want to have some from each group, basically, a letter from each group. The COAT, the Control Oral Word Association Test, is a very commonly used letter fluency test. And it uses 2 parallel sets of letters. It uses CFL and then PRW. And it was actually developed as part of the multilingual aphasia examination. Letter fluency tests, but also just verbal fluency tests in general, are really commonly used to help diagnose aphasias. So yeah, the COAT uses CFL and PRW as its parameters, but the FAS is still used in many other test batteries, including the DCEFS battery. And then also a lot of test batteries will use their own versions of verbal fluency tests. Some test batteries that have a verbal fluency component include the multilingual aphasia examination here, the neurosensory center comprehensive examination for aphasia, DCEFS, KBNA, and NEPC. So now switching gears a little bit to the semantic fluency. We talked about this before as well. The participant needs to produce as many words as possible, this is wrong. It's not beginning with a specified letter. It's that are involved in a specific category. Actually, give me 1 second. I'm going to change this. Okay, now we're all better. The participant needs to produce as many words as possible within a specified category during a fixed period of time. The most common category that's used is animals, but other categories that are used in some verbal fluency tests include things like food names, first names of boys or first names of girls, fruits and vegetables, things in the kitchen, things in a supermarket, things to wear, things that get you from one place to another, modes of transportation. And then here are just some so these are the standards that are used. There are also some variations of semantic fluency tests where people will introduce another component. So instead of just naming words in a category, Heller and Dobbs combined phonemic and semantic fluency and had them do both tasks at the same time. So for example, they would say something like, give me as many animal names that you could think of that begin with the letter A, both semantic and letter. There are also some tests that have action fluency, so they'll ask participants to name verbs or things that people do. The DCEFS verbal fluency tests, also includes a category switching task where participants need to switch between categories. So I'll say, tell me as many fruits and then as many pieces of furniture as you can think of, and go back and forth. So give me a fruit, then a piece of furniture, then a fruit, then a piece of furniture. And each of these variations, just try to increase the executive load, because that tells you something else about the cognition that's happening in these participants. So let's go a little bit into scoring. So for both phonemic and semantic fluency, what you want to do is you want to write the examinee's responses verbatim in order, including any incorrect responses. So if they give you, for example, a word that doesn't begin with the right letter, you're still going to write it down. Or if they give you a proper noun, you're still going to write it down. This is an example of a scoring sheet that I got from Dr. Hannah Lindsay, who works with me at the TBICC. And this is just one example of what a verbal fluency scoring sheet might look like. You have your letters up here, you can write all of them down, write all the responses, and then you have a category and you can write all the responses. In the Strauss Compendium, it says, for verbal fluency tests, no specific material is required. Users may design their own materials and use the norms presented in that book, or they may purchase the test as part of a larger standardized battery. This is awesome because it means that basically, if you wanted to, you could just design your own verbal fluency test under these same parameters, or design your own scoring sheet, I guess. But you also have to be careful and remember that every version of a verbal fluency test you administer might be slightly different. So you need to be careful to really read those directions. Yeah. So the total score at the bottom here usually includes only correct responses. Even though you wrote down the errors, you won't count them in your total. But some common errors that we find in verbal fluency are repetitions, which is the same response given multiple times. Sometimes you'll see set losses, so response that don't fit the task parameters. They either give you an incorrect first letter or category, they name a proper noun, they go back to a previous task. When you're in the A group, they give you something that begins with the letter F. All of those errors are important. They give us clues about the participant's cognition, but we don't count them in the total score usually. So let's talk also about some categories or strategies to look at when you're scoring. So when you're scoring, it's not important to not only look at how many words someone produces, but also the order in which those words are produced. So like we talked about before, there are two main processes involved in verbal fluency performance. One, we talked about how you need an intact semantic store, or a knowledge base, right, from which to draw the words. And two, you need an effective search process in order to retrieve that information. So subpar verbal fluency performance can be due to a deterioration of either of those things. It can either be due to a deterioration of your knowledge base, or you don't really have the words in there, or it could be due to an ineffective search strategy. You can't come up with new search strategies once your first is exhausted. And Troyer figured out a way to kind of differentiate between those two deficits by doing something in scoring called looking for clustering and switching. He looked for patterns in the order of responses so that he could differentiate between the two errors. So clustering is something that you'll look for in your participant's response. It's their ability to produce a lot of words within a subcategory. So for example, clustering in a phonemic group might be saying a lot of words with the same first two letters. So apple and appendix and appendage, that's a cluster. Saying words that are different by only a vowel sound, like shirt and short, or homonyms like pear and pear the fruit and pear too. Semantic clusters look like words that are in the same semantic subcategory. So if your overall category was animals, a semantic cluster could be, for example, they give you a string of farm animals, then they give you a string of African animals, and then they give you a string of birds, and then a string of different types of fish. Those are different clusters. And this is a relatively automatic process. Once you land on a subcategory, a cluster, it's pretty automatic to come up with words that fall into that cluster. And he also found that decreased clustering often related to temporal lobe disturbances or other memory disturbances like Alzheimer's disease. And then switching, on the other hand, is when you switch from one subcategory to a new subcategory. You were clustering within the farm animals, and then you switched and started clustering within the African animals. And this generally requires a lot more effort and cognitive flexibility because you're coming up with a new search parameter. Decreased switching, they found, could be related to more of an impaired frontal lobe. So instead of the temporal lobe disturbances, it was more impaired executive control, a decreased mental flexibility, things like that. Oops, excuse me. So now let's talk really quickly about some demographic trends with verbal fluency. There are a lot of resources and citations in the Strauss Compendium about demographic trends. You can look for them under the demographic effects subheading in the Strauss Compendium, but here are just some general trends that I wanted to highlight for you guys. So based on current literature, age does have an effect on verbal fluency ability. So phonemic performance generally increases with age, peaks in your 30s, and then decreases with old age. And semantic fluency does the same thing, though not as steeply as letter fluency, and starts to decline around age 20 instead of age 30. Higher education is also associated with better performance on both letter and category fluency tests. And many researchers report that education actually accounts for more variance than age in phonemic fluency, so in your letter fluency. But for semantic fluency, age is a bigger factor than education. A lot in terms of gender, a lot of reports show little evidence of any gender differences in both of these fluency tests. But some studies report that women have a small advantage over men for letter fluency tasks, including a meta-analysis of 17,625 healthy individuals found that as well, that women have a slight advantage in letter fluency. And then ethnicity and language. So generally, some studies have shown that ethnicity has significant effects on both letter and animal tasks specifically, not other categories. With the Caucasian ethnicity sometimes being associated with better performance, even when income, education, and reading scores are considered. But most of what they find is that instead of different performance levels, just different types of words are produced by different ethnic groups. For example, they did a meta-analysis on animal fluency in a bunch of different ethnicities, and they found that the Vietnamese ethnicity group produced the most animal names, and the Hispanic ethnicity group produced the least number of names. But when they went in and looked at it, they were like, maybe that's actually because there's a lot of one-syllable animal names in the Vietnamese language, and Spanish has a lot more multi-syllable animal names. So maybe the Vietnamese group was able to say more because there were shorter words. So those are also some confounding variables that we need to look at when we're talking about ethnicity. And as I said before, any language differences in verbal fluency, researchers have found less difference in the actual test performance and more differences in the types of words that are produced. So not so much in the number of words, but in the types of words. Let's talk, I'm not going to talk so much about norms. This is just here for you to come back to and reference if you're interested. But normative data is so important for any neuropsychological test. So normative data, what are norms? Normative data is data that characterizes for us what is normal in a defined population at a specific point in time. And they're usually derived from a large sample that's representative of your population of interest. So you can have normative data based on age or based on language or based on gender or based on ethnicity. And as we have just seen in this previous slide, demographic trends do affect verbal fluency. And that's why it's so important to be using norms for your data so that you can actually have a common baseline from which to evaluate all of your participants. Otherwise, the data that you get in longitudinal studies and things like that, or even just when you're comparing groups of people, might not be correct. Okay. Again, like I said, I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are just some of the most prominent normative data sets that have been provided for verbal fluency. But in general, the rule is that there's a lack of ethnic and gender diversity in our norms currently for verbal fluency. And so it limits how well we compare our scores from participants of diverse backgrounds. So just keep that in mind when you're using verbal fluency as a measure. I did want to note, however, that the DCAFS test normed their tests on 1,750 non-clinical participants in a large age group with representative numbers from different ethnic groups and different levels of education, and they had roughly equal gender representation. So the norms for the DCAFs are really awesome right now. We're going to go through a couple more things before I let you go. The second to last thing we're going to talk about is some neuroanatomical correlates for verbal fluency. So what do verbal fluency deficits mean in terms of your actual brain? A lot of research has found that left frontal lobe lesions specifically are generally associated with decreased performance on letter fluency tests specifically. Some more specific areas, if you care, are the dorsolateral and striatal areas of the left frontal lobe, as well as the superior medial frontal lobe and the left parietal lobe actually as well. Lesions in these regions had some impact on category fluency, but not as much as on letter fluency. However, the right dorsolateral and inferior medial frontal lesions did show decreased performance on category fluency. And they also have found that aside from the frontal lobe, the temporal lobe here plays a huge role in semantic performance, but not so much in letter performance. In general, meta-analyses have shown that both letter and category fluency make similar demands on the frontal lobe, but that semantic fluency alone requires greater activation of your temporal lobe too. So frontal lobe is required for both. Temporal lobe is really prominent in semantic fluency. And this research is also supported by PET scans in healthy individuals. PET scans they use a tracer basically to track the metabolic activity of your brain. So figure out which areas of your brain are active. And they found very similar results with which areas of the brain are active during letter or category fluency tests. Lastly, we're going to talk about some clinical applications of verbal fluency. In other words, what some deficits of verbal fluency can mean in terms of common clinical disorders. So for aphasia, they found that across the board, people with aphasia generally produce fewer words in general, or they produce a number of words but have many errors. And it just depends on the type of aphasia, fluent or non-fluent aphasia. They also see in populations with aphasia that they will have a lot of frequent repetitions in their responses, which also happens in populations that have frontal lobe damage, interestingly enough. With TBI and head injury, verbal fluency is a huge measure that we use to track different things with TBI. Because frontal lobes are particularly affected in traumatic brain injury, which often affects these people's executive functioning. So Iverson looked at CFL performance with those letters C, F, and L in 669 people that had mild to severe head injury. And they found decreased verbal fluency performance with clear relation to the severity of TBI. So if someone had mild TBI, they did slightly better on the verbal fluency test than someone who had severe TBI. Dementia. In dementia, they have found that semantic fluency tests are often helpful in diagnosing dementia, but only when they're used in conjunction with other tests. It's very, very important to always use verbal fluency in conjunction with other tests. You should not make a diagnosis purely on a verbal fluency score. Some studies even suggest that discrepancies between phonemic and semantic fluency performance can help you figure out which type of dementia someone has. They've found that generally in people with Alzheimer's disease or Parkinson's disease, their phonemic score will be a lot higher than their semantic score, which makes sense because their semantic storage is decreased in Alzheimer's disease. However, some research has shown the opposite. So score discrepancies really should be used sparingly. with dementia diagnoses. And then lastly, mood and thought disorders. In depression, they see decreased fluency scores as distress increases. So as the depression gets worse, the verbal fluency decreases. And they think that that's more due to cognitive slowing in general, rather than specifically executive dysfunction. And also in schizophrenia, they saw that category fluency was significantly more impaired than phonemic fluency. Okay, so before we exit, here are just some general things to remember when you're using verbal fluency tests. Number one, it's always important with all neuropsych, not just verbal fluency, to use the most updated and current norms that you can find. And the reason for this is, remember that age, gender, education, and ethnicity have been shown to play a role in verbal fluency performance. So if you want accurate data, you should use the most updated norms. You should also remember to use alternate forms of these tests when you're retesting within a shorter time frame to avoid practice effects. If you ask someone to do the same letter task, even within a month, research has shown that the practice effect will play a big role in increasing their performance, and that could be a confounding variable for you in your research. And then also remember that you can use deficits and errors in your verbal fluency tasks to provide a direction for diagnosis, but verbal fluency should never be used as a diagnostic tool alone. It is important to use these tests in conjunction with other neuropsychological tests and batteries, and I think that that's just a good strategy regardless of what neuropsych test you're using. You should never use just one test to make your decisions. So as a summary, the key components of verbal fluency require an intact semantic store and the ability to access it, and then good executive functioning so that you can retrieve the information that is relative to the bounds of each task. And I'll close this out with a quote from Strauss. They said that even though we know a lot about verbal fluency, the psychological mechanisms underlying verbal fluency still remain to be worked out. All we know is that word knowledge, episodic memory, working memory, speed of processing information, and effortful self-initiation appear to be integral components. And with that, I will leave you to your other neuropsych lectures and end this lecture about verbal fluency.